now. I'll let everyone see. Yeah.
We're good?
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, let's pray. We wait for you, Lord. Our souls wait for you. In your word is our hope. Amen.
Amen.
Well, I'm really glad to be with you again today. It's good to see you. And we did a little experiment on the first Sunday of January. After the homily, we had a few minutes for discussion. So let's try that again today. A few minutes for responses or discussion. And when I do this kind of thing, I always encourage people to think about three kinds of questions to follow up with. So the first one is, did you hear something that you agree with or that you would like to affirm or celebrate? Because speakers always need some encouragement before you rip into them, you know. So something you agree with or affirm. The second question would be, is there a place where you had questions or you would push back or you would like to debate? Debating is fine. I'm a Dutchman. I don't know how many of you have experience with Dutch people, but they like debating, so no problem. So any place you want to push back or raise questions, that's fine. And then third, I always encourage people to try to think of one aspect of the sermon that they want to remember well, one thing that they want to remember well. So one insight or encouragement or even a question that you think maybe God has addressed to you, one thing you'd like to remember well. So keep those three things in mind as I speak, and then, as I say, we'll have a few minutes at the end process to get those together. I'm really glad to speak about Isaiah 6. I've chosen to speak about Isaiah 6, and I'm really glad it was in the lectionary reading today because Isaiah 6 is one of my favorite passages. If you know me long enough and hear me preach often enough, I will often claim on Sunday mornings that this is one of my favorite passages. And I'm not just being a politician. There just are so many passages in the scriptures that I love by now and that speak to me so deeply. Isaiah 6 is a very powerful passage because it describes a worship scene that occurred in the temple during Isaiah's time. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And it's a significant passage for people who are interested in worship. It's often at the center of people who try to write up a theology of worship, what we understand by worship. It's a very powerful scene of worship, as you know. And I'll say more about that in a sec. But one other place that I want to go for introduction is just to say that we know in the church for years now there has been controversy about the meaning, purposes, and practices of worship. And some of the struggles in our churches have been bitter. I often dealt with these concerns as a pastor as people struggled to know what is worship, what to do with worship. I didn't have it as rough as some of my colleagues did. Some churches became divided over issues of worship, and these struggles were so bitter that they have been called worship wars. Imagine that, worship wars, fighting over what it means to worship God. And the dilemmas are familiar. They include questions about how do we welcome newcomers into our church? How do we employ technology? What kind of music should we sing and offer? And these are very difficult questions to sort through, as I'm sure you know, and I'm not sure that they can be solved in straightforward debates, actually. And I don't want to maybe I shouldn't raise them because I don't want to get mired in these contentious issues today, but I just want to name them as an awareness in the background. And all of this has grown more complicated in some ways during the epidemic because we ask ourselves, what does it mean that we cannot meet together in the flesh? We are people who believe in the incarnation, and so being together in person is really, really important. And so many of our encounters now are mediated by technology, as they are today. And I understand you have a lot of technology-mediated meetings in the near future. Is it vestry this afternoon, did you say? And Bible study coming up. So that's going on a lot. And I think there are a few questions we have in the back of our minds as we experience all this. And one would be, what's going to happen when or if life returns to normal? What's ahead? Will we be able to meet together again? I trust we will. But what will that meeting be like? Will we still have to wear masks? I think there's a good chance that we'll be wearing masks for a long time. Will we have to distance socially during our worship? That's been hard too. Will we be able to participate in communion, or how do we participate in communion? So there's a lot of questions that we're going to have to deal with. And one of the things that, by the way, I'm a cat lover, so.
Okay, me too.
Okay. And a dog lover, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a new dog. So, yeah, there are going to be a lot of questions. And one of the things that I've been realizing is that as we change from pandemic to endemic and then resume some sort of life as normal, I thought everybody was going to celebrate and be happy. But when I see the disruptions in our cities here in Canada, I'm realizing that the return to so-called normal is going to be very complicated. A lot of feelings have been surfaced. And so it's not just going to be a party and we get on as before. I think there are going to be a lot of adjustments. And so there are going to be questions for us as our churches get back to some sort of post-pandemic reality. Almost certainly a number of things are going to change, and we are not sure how. And again, I don't want to get mired into speculating too much about this today. We're just going to have to take things a step at a time. And the reason I'm raising these controversial issues is because I want to talk today about worship. But I want to talk about worship in a little different way than sometimes you hear about it. So one thing that I wonder about when life gets back to closer to normal is whether or not people will return to church. I know some people who have really enjoyed being online, and they just want to do that from now on. I know that some pastors are struggling with, will they continue to do some online things afterwards? Will they do some sort of hybrid? Have people fallen out of the habit of going to church? I'm not sure. Do they just prefer the conveniences of online worship? Again, we don't know for sure. So we have those questions, we have those concerns about worship, and I want to be really clear that I fully support the bishops having been so cautious in how we deal with the pandemic. My wife is a nurse practitioner, and she's dealing with the pandemic on the front lines. So in our household, we take these things very seriously. We believe in listening to science, and I'm glad that the bishops have encouraged us all to practice a phrase that was new to me 2 years ago, but we've heard many times since, an abundance of caution. I think that's the right way to go. I don't have a question about that. And I also want to be clear that I really support experimenting with technology to offer what we can, as we are doing here today, and as so many churches have been doing. So I support these things. I certainly support the wardens and leadership at St. Thomas for its experiment in making things work in this way at this time. And I'm very glad to be part of that, as I have been happy also to help other Anglican churches who are experimenting with hybrids. And it's funny, everybody's doing something slightly differently. So that's interesting to me too. But as I say, I hope all of this is temporary, and we may continue using technology in new ways that we've learned during these past 2 years, but I hope that we can start moving back to prioritizing meeting together where possible. What we are doing is good. It's the best we can do at this time, but it's less than the ideal. So today, in anticipation of coming back to normal, I want to highlight 3 aspects of worship that I think are always important. And they don't always come up in our discussions and our debates, but for me, they're primary whenever I think about worship. There are 3 priorities to keep in mind when our worship traditions transitions back to whatever it's going to be in the future. A number of years ago, I befriended a Coptic Orthodox priest. I don't know if you know much about Coptic Orthodoxy. It's one of the oldest forms of Christianity in the world, actually, historically. And these are Egyptian believers. They're among the most ancient Christians around. A lot of Egyptians have immigrated here. A lot of Copts have immigrated here to North America. And so I befriended this priest. I was interested in Orthodox Christianity. I was interested in Christianity in the Middle East. We often don't realize that there are a lot of Christians in Egypt and Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and that is a very persecuted and harassed community. Christianity is actually threatened in the Middle East. So not only am I interested in Orthodoxy, I'm interested in Christians in the Middle East. So when I had a day off as a pastor, I often went to his church on Sunday mornings, and the services were fascinating. They were 2.5 to 3 hours every Sunday. Can you imagine?
Wow.
2.5 hours to 3 hours. And much of the service was the same thing week after week. There were things that got repeated week after week. And there was room for a little homily. Sometimes the priest, he would be waving incense around. He'd be walking around the nave, and then he'd stop by me when he saw me. He said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Why don't you preach today?" And so I learned always to have to check out the text ahead of time and to have the outline of a sermon in my head. So I did that a number of times. It was a fascinating liturgy. They had Coptic. The Coptic language was used, Arabic was used, Greek was used, and English was used. So a lot of it I didn't necessarily literally understand. But it was a beautiful liturgy, beautiful singing, and the sanctuary was especially beautiful. It was filled with icons on the walls. There were even icons in the dome. Behind the altar, there was an immense icon of Jesus Christ the Lord reigning on a throne in the clouds. And up in the dome also there was a skylight, so you could look up and see actual clouds floating by while you worshiped, which lent an air of authenticity to the icon of Christ's rule. And I'll never forget that one day when I was there, the service was long, and I'd been smelling a lot of incense, and somehow I was overcome. It very much affected me. We were well into the service. We were reciting an ancient creed, and it felt to me as if the ceiling of the building had opened, and I was face to face with heaven, and I was overcome with emotion and found myself exclaiming within, "I believe, I believe, I believe." Such can be the converting power of worship. Isaiah 6 is a model for understanding worship, that kind of worship, but also more common worship. The chapter begins with the phrase, "In the year King Uzziah died." So it begins with a historical event. It begins with something that would have been the headline of the day. And the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah had an extraordinary vision of God enthroned, God on the throne. Now this is interesting for a number of reasons. One is Uzziah was a king and he was beloved in Israel, which, by the way, was a rare exemption. If you look at the kings of Israel and Judah, most of them were not very good. The Bible is quite clear on that. They're dismissed. But he was a good king on the whole, overall. He did make some tragic mistakes, and yet his death was a cause of great grief for the Israelites. And so in this time of sorrow, the Israelites are being reminded in this vision to remember, yes, you were attached to this king who was good in many ways, not perfect as no human is, but please remember who your true king is. And the true king, of course, is God. God is the ruler. And this is something that we emphasize again and again in worship. So think of that vision or experience that I had in the Coptic church. The psalmist says in Psalm 22, I This is another of my favorite verses. You are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. You are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And what I understand from that is that in some way, when we worship, we are part of God's ongoing coronation. We are reinforcing God being on the throne. We are acknowledging our obedience and allegiance to this king on the throne. So worship celebrates God's ongoing coronation. We celebrate the rule of God in the community of Christ. In worship, we crown God. In worship, we remember our God reigns. Worship proclaims the kingship of God, or as we sometimes say it, the lordship of Christ. And this kingship of God is not flight from the world in the peace and quiet of the sanctuary. The intent of this worship is to carry the message of the kingship of God and the lordship of Christ from the sanctuary where we are out to the wider world. Isaiah 6, the Isaiah 6 narrator has an extraordinary vision. I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. Furthermore, the pivot on the thresholds shook, and the house filled with smoke. This vision I want to suggest today shows us 3 important aspects of worship that I want to remind us about today. First, worship is about awe, A-W-E. I used to sing with young people's group, Our God is an Awesome God. Maybe you've heard that song. Our God is an awesome God. Worship reminds us that our God is an awesome God, that our God is enthroned, that our God's robe fills the temple, that our God's glory saturates the earth, that our God is attended by heavenly beings. The thresholds shake, and in the face of that, Isaiah confesses both his unworthiness and the unworthiness of his people. So this vision that Isaiah has is not casual recreation. It's not watching Netflix or a YouTube video. This is not entertainment. Worship is not about being buddies with God. Perhaps there is a place for being buddies with God, but not in corporate worship. Worship is not casual. It's not relaxed. It fits Psalm 29. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of God's name. Worship the Lord worship the Lord. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. So what I want to say is that the first thing we need to acknowledge about worship is that it's an overwhelming experience of awe and reverence. The Creator inspires in us fear because of God's power and because of God's purity. There is a great majesty about God that we need to keep in mind. According to the book of Hebrews, we owe worship with reverence and awe to our God who is, as the author of Hebrews says, a consuming fire. And we have a number of moments in our Anglican liturgy where we acknowledge this. You might think, for example, where we recite or sing, Holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory. Hosanna in the highest. So worship is about awe. Second, worship is not individualistic. It's not private. Worship connects us broadly, widely, and deeply in many different directions. Worship connects us with God. Worship connects us with the heavenly beings that we hear about here in Isaiah. God's worship connects us with God's work, and grace. And worship connects us with other believers. This passage reminds us of this because, among other things, it refers, as I said, to a historical person, King Uzziah. And further reference is made to the people among whom Isaiah lives. And even heavenly beings show up in this passage. Seraphs with six wings who sing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of God's glory." So worship, corporate worship, what we do on Sundays is not just Jesus and me, introverted, isolated, mystical experiences. Worship connects us with far-flung realities and spheres. Worship connects us on many levels. It makes many connections. And when we worship, we join the choirs of angels who are worshiping God. We join the worshipers in heaven who are worshiping God, especially as portrayed in the book of Revelation. I think some of you are studying the book of Revelation. There are these magnificent scenes of worshipers in the book of Revelation. When we worship at the same time with believers around the world. And we're connected with all those that we've worshiped with during our life. We're connected with all those who have taught us the faith, who have taught us to believe, who have taught us to worship, who have taught us to be faithful to Jesus. So it's a very powerful thing to engage in worship. And the third thing that I think is very, very important about worship, and we see it here in Isaiah 6, is that a true worshipful encounter with God changes us. It reminds us of what is most important. It reminds us of our highest values and priorities. True worship, when we leave true worship, often we will be challenged or transformed, or we will know what we're supposed to do next. We see it again in this passage. Isaiah is brought up short by this divine confrontation, and he knows immediately that both he and his people are unworthy. They are of unclean lips, he says. He sees himself and he sees his people with new and unsettling clarity because of the worship. And true worship does that. In worship, the Christian is questioned. The Christian is judged. And at times, the Christian is left speechless by the center of our faith. And then you'll notice that Isaiah goes on to accept the call in this worship to be about God's mission. Worship helps humans discover the meaning and make sense of their lives and the world. Christian worship brings wholeness, it brings direction, it brings purpose, and it engages the whole of our lives. It integrates all of our life so that what we confess and enact in worship extends over the rest of our lives. It should make a difference in how we live the following 6 days. To summarize then, Christian worship prioritizes the glorifying and honoring and enjoying of God. Worship leaves us in awe of God, connected with God and God's creatures and creation, and worship sends us on God's mission. Our regular weekly worship might not precisely equal every week the exalted Isaiah 6 experience. Maybe we never have exactly that kind of experience. Nevertheless, worship needs these elements and points us in that direction. No matter what life looks like after the pandemic, no matter what our churches go, I want to remind us, for one, about the awesomeness. I want worship to remind us about the awesomeness and majesty of our God who reigns, to connect us widely and deeply with God, with heavenly beings, other believers, past and present and future, and with God's creation. And third, to change our lives accordingly by calling us into faithfulness and mission on God's behalf. I think most of you know by now that I'm a relatively new Anglican. I'm not a cradle Anglican. And the reason that I became an Anglican when I was in my 50s was because of worship, and because I became convicted more and more of the importance of worship and how we worship. So when I'm at churches, I like to tell the Altar Guild that I'm an Anglican because of the Altar Guild. I don't know if you have any Altar Guild people here, but kudos to you. So I wasn't born into this denomination, the Anglican denomination. I was part of another denomination, even ordained in another denomination for a number of decades, and it's a denomination I still respect and honor, especially for its ethics and service. Yes. But as I studied the history and theology of worship over the years, I appreciated that Anglicanism, in fact, does the three things that I've talked about. It helps us recognize God's awesomeness. It connects us widely and deeply to earthly and heavenly realities, and consequently has the power to orient us more deeply into God's purposes and mission. When Lorna and I moved to Toronto 13 years ago, we'd been living in Indiana for a few years, but we came back to Canada. We're very glad about that in 2009. And we chose a home. We found a home that was a reasonable commute to the school where I was going to teach. That was the reason that we were moving. And I searched the web about Anglican churches in Toronto many times before we came here. And I discovered that there was an Anglican church just a few blocks away from the house that we purchased, not far from our new home. So our first Sunday in Toronto, first Sunday in July, we walked to that church. And many things impressed me about that day. The priest warmly welcomed us in the foyer. He has since become a very dear friend and colleague of mine. He preached an excellent sermon on being raised in a mission-minded church in Saskatchewan. Turns out he too was not a cradle Anglican. But he spoke in a way that honored the evangelical upbringing that he had, and I appreciated that. So that was all good. And then something happened. I saw that folks take worship very seriously at that church. It's a congregation of people from around the world, and white people in that congregation are a minority. Sometimes I count up how many white people there are because I'm curious, and there are very few of us. And there are a lot of people, especially from the West Indies, different countries in the West Indies, and from Sri Lanka, and from Hong Kong. We have Tamil services and Mandarin services, and more we have people coming from Africa. So it was, and you can tell by the clothes that people have come from around the world. So I was very, very impressed that day as I saw people go forward to receive communion. And I saw them in their beautiful clothes from many parts of the world, an array of nationalities in various ages, and the beauty of what they wore stood out in front of the old altar. And I joined in that line towards the front, and to me, I felt like I had a vision of heaven. Because as I saw all those people around the world worshiping and taking communion, I remembered what Jesus said. I tell you, many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And each service, I believe, we join with those celebrating at that moment and those who celebrated in the past and those who will celebrate in the future. It's kind of a beyond time moment. Worship then reminds us of God's power and majesty. It enthrones God. It roots us in God and each other in God's works and sends us as God's people to promote God's reign to the glory of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I'd be glad to hear if there's anything that you want to offer in response to the homily, and just a reminder that I really like the practice of saying at least one or two things up front that you agree with or affirm, and then giving some room for exploration or pushback or debate. And then finally, I'll ask you if there's one thing you'd like to remember well. So, any affirmations or agreements?
Could I just note that if you're muted, if you want to talk, please press your space bar and you can be heard.
Good point.
My comment would be, wow.
That's a positive comment, I believe, Todd.
I think so.
I would just like to say, I once heard someone say that we use the word awesome too much.
Yeah.
That we call everything, oh, that's awesome.
Right.
I saw this movie, it was awesome. You know, that should be reserved for God and God only. So I agree with that.
Thanks, Kathy.
Father, do you have that sermon on your computer?
Yes, I do.
If I hang around at the end, could I give you my email address and you could perhaps send it to me?
You emailed me before, right? So we should be able to connect. You could just email me a reminder, Phil. You want to do that?
I'll need to get your email.
Didn't you email me before?
That was Phil, I think.
What's that?
Phil did.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
This is Stephen.
Steve.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
It's my brother.
To the church.
His brother.
It'd be worth just emailing it right to St. Thomas's.
Yeah, Tracy, you
Yeah.
can handle all the rest.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do that.
Well,
Is that enough affirmation?
Reminder. I might need a reminder, but happy to do that. And the other thing you need to know is that my manuscript is not it's not proofread, and it's not always full sentences. Sometimes it's just a point here or there.
Got notes.
So that I ad lib sometimes in the sermon. So I said some things today that weren't in my notes, but this will give you if you're willing to be patient with that, this will give you the gist of what I'm trying to say. So was it Stephen then? Is your name
Stephen. Yeah, Stephen Newell.
And are you literally brothers? Because your brothers in Christ. Are you literally brothers?
No, we just talk a lot.
Oh, good.
If I could offer one, the last story I had a picture of Pentecost,
Yeah.
and
Here goes.
and the first story with the skylight and the clouds, that also was of heavenly,
Yes.
the heavenly realm.
Yes.
And I will remember, I think in reading your book, I've come to have it reinforced, the awe, and then the connection, and then the transformation and going forth. That's what I'll remember.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, good. Yeah, the Pentecost is a good connection, and a number of you I know are studying the book of Acts. So that's a very, very powerful aspect of our Christian faith. And
Father, can you turn your sound up a bit?
I don't. I'm having trouble hearing me, eh?
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there a way to do that?
You should have a little speaker icon on the bottom right on this computer anyway. No?
No, I don't have that. No.
Try top right
Well, there's something that
on the keyboard.
I see speaker.
I'll try turning the speaker in the church up and see if that helps, okay?
Okay.
I know it does with the,
Sound was okay before when you were.
Did you hear the homily okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Any other questions, pushback?
I'd just like to make one comment.
Please, Phil.
When I was a little boy and I was a cradle Anglican,
Oh.
God to me was a guy sitting up on a throne on a white cloud.
Uh-huh.
And that persisted until I became an engineer. And then for a while, I really didn't know. But slowly it began to form in my mind as I looked up at the heavens, the stars, the planets, and I learned more about astronomy, and I began to think, where did all this come from?
Yeah.
I began to say, well, it was God that did all that.
Yeah.
And that is really awesome. When I look up at the stars and imagine what's beyond them, I am filled with a sense of awe. And to me, today, that's what God's all about. And I just want to leave that thought with you, that what is God? What is this thing we worship, this person or this idea that we worship? We call it God, and to me that satisfies my requirement for knowing what God is. We perhaps all have a different idea of what God is, but I think we have to all agree that it's an awesome thing and it is worthy of worship. And all the ethical issues that come from that are all worthwhile. And that part of our problem today with our societies is that we've lost sight of that.
Yeah.
So that's what I had to say.
Yeah, I like that. I also had an experience, I think I've mentioned this before, that when I was 20, my sister died, my only sibling. She was 17. And this really shook my faith, and I really struggled with my faith. And at one point I was doing a lot of arguing with God, and I didn't know where to go with that. And one of the things that happened was I went out at night in the dark, and I was arguing with God, and even trying to question whether God existed. And then I saw the stars, and I was so overcome with the beauty of the night sky. That was a really key moment in helping me get lodged more firmly in the faith. The other thing I want to say is that to riff on your point is, I think that this experience of being overwhelmed and in awe is really, really important, and it's missing in our society. We live in a society where we expect to control everything. Technology is about control, and so we control the climate in the house and the degree of the lights, and we're in control, and we're used to that. We like that. And when I was a professor, I used to take people on courses. We would go in the wilderness. We'd camp and canoe for a week in the wilderness. And always part of my hidden agenda, and I didn't necessarily say this to the students, but part of my agenda for them was I wanted them to have an experience where they were not fully in control. When they realized that there's something out there much larger than them. Because when you're in the wilderness, I always told them, it's not wilderness unless there's something there that could kill you. When you're in the wilderness, there's so much beyond your control. And it's so much larger. You see the beauty of creation. And so it's an opportunity. I found that was an opportunity to experience the awesomeness of God. And I think that in our technological world, we don't have enough of those experiences.
Right.
Go ahead, Peter.
No, Mary Mitchell.
Just responding to what you just said, I'm a long time member of Al-Anon, all based on having no control.
Right.
That's my first 44 years a member of Al-Anon. Still, more than half my life. Okay, but I love the 3 steps, the 3 things, and I wrote them down. The awesomeness, very much. Being together is important. That's why I'm here, the connection with each other. But the last one, and maybe some of you have heard me say this, the way we finish our service is, maybe it's no other church but Anglican say that, and with intention. My body and my mind and my heart acknowledge the power that is given to us. Or I'm going to say it. I wrote it down. Working in us, that we can infinitely. We couldn't do it without this God. And I love that we finish our service with that intention.
Me too.
Thank you.
Good. You're a good worship theologian.
Alva, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I particularly loved the last story about all the diversity in the church that you went to. And I went to a very poor church in Toronto. I think it was in the distillery district. But anyway, when I was there, I couldn't believe how many people from all around the world attended there, and everyone was welcome. And there were people, I'm sure they were homeless, and they were welcomed into the church as well.
Great.
And it was an Anglican church. It just moved me, and it reminded me of that service when you told about the service you attended.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say that I really like the way that you said post-pandemic reality. I'm so sick of hearing a new normal. I like post-pandemic reality. And I'm concerned about people coming back to church as well.
Yeah.
Because we've gotten too used to the way it is now.
Right. Too comfortable. Yeah. I see somebody else here. Peter, do you want to moderate? I can't.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to, is it Catherine? Okay.
I am a news political junkie or addict.
Okay.
But when I'm at church in worship with the liturgy, none of that matters.
Right.
And it's a sort of like a time out of time where you don't worry about that. And the one thing you do think about is the idea that there will come a time when all of those things will be irrelevant.
Mhm.
And so that's important to me. And the end of the service where we are told to go and peace and serve the Lord.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lovely, lovely thing to think about. And of course, you go back to being so concerned about all those things that are going on in the world, but at least you have that time.
Yeah.
When that's not relevant.
And it gives us some perspective, right, on the things that are going on in the wider world. So anyway, yeah, you're a good worship theologian too. You're a powerhouse over there at St. Thomas.
Have you got room for one more?
Of course.
Phil's comment that he used to view God as sitting on a cloud on a big throne reminded me that many years ago at our church at St. Thomas's, we had a men's group, and we invited a different clergyman, I think they were all men at that time, to come and speak to our group. And one of the questions that we always asked was, how do you conceptualize God? How do you think about God? What image do you have?
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask that of you, Arthur, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh dear. That says it all.
So, I think my image. There's a famous Russian Orthodox icon by Rublev's Trinity. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It shows three angels sitting around a table, and it's sort of like the three angels in that. It's sort of like the angels that meet Abraham in the book of Genesis, but it's also an allusion to the Trinity. And there's a sense of a community around the table, and they're on three sides of the table, and one side is open, and that's because we are invited to be part of the table. So I think that would count as, for me, a very important way that I conceptualize God. But the conceptualize, it's always a metaphor. I know it's always a metaphor. It's always limited, right? And I grew up in a tradition actually where we weren't supposed to picture God. And I understand that because God is always beyond us. And how do we picture somebody who's responsible for creating the amazing universe, the stars? Obviously we can't do all of that. But I am convinced that this God, this huge God who is so far beyond our conception, is personally connected with us and in us. And that personal connection has come through in a number of ways. And I take great heart in that. So I take great I take great consolation in that.
I really like what you said, especially about not conceptualizing God.
Right.
We had one Catholic theologian who even called it idolatrous.
That's the danger, yeah. But of course, we can't, none of us can think completely in abstraction. So we make up these. That's why when I preach, you like it when I tell stories, and you don't want me to just tell you straight theological theory. You want stories, because we hang our thoughts and our ideas and our imagination on stories. And so we do that with God too. But we also have to be very careful of not making an idol of our particular conceptions. Well, one or two more. How are we doing here? Coming along service.
Yeah, I was going to say, did anyone have the Isaiah, the reference to the fact that I am unworthy, and then the coal touching his lips, and then him saying, "Pick me"?
Yeah,
was very powerful.
Yeah. I think Todd maybe wants to say "wow" again.
Sure. Oh, Todd, come on, buddy.
Well, I don't know if I should say this or not, but
go for it.
I had to drop out of Facebook last night because I temporarily disconnected from my account because I just get so angry because this God of the universe, creator of the stars, is so often kidnapped. And I saw him plastered on some propaganda blessing truckers. And I'm sure he's blessing the truckers, but it's just he's so abused, and we stuff him wherever we want to stuff him. It just really seems sacrilegious to me somehow. So I don't know if I should say that or not, but I suspect he's on both sides of a lot of issues. Anyways, just throwing that out there.
So I don't know if I should say this or not, but I'm very suspicious about how technology gets used in our culture, and I'm not opposed to the use of technology. You can't be opposed to use of technology. You can't have civilization without technology. Technology is a gift. But I have very serious concerns about how things have developed in the last couple of decades. One of my books is about that. It's called Living into Focus. And recently I was at a meeting. Priests, we priests here in the Diocese of Toronto, we have to take training every 3 years about boundaries and abuse and all that kind of stuff. That's a good thing. But the last time, it was a 3 or 4 hour meeting, and I can't tell you how much of our time was spent on Facebook. And the diocese, talking about Facebook. And the diocese has clearly said they're not ruling against Facebook, but they're recommending that priests not let their congregants into their personal Facebook accounts, that they have 2 different accounts. And it was said very clearly more than once. Priests kept asking over and over, but it's the diocese telling me not to do this with Facebook. And so the same thing was repeated. And I just finally said, we broke up into small groups. And I said, well, why don't we just all get off Facebook? I'm not on Facebook, but
neither am I.
Why don't we stop Facebook? And it was one of those moments where, I don't know if this ever happened to you, Todd, but you say something in a room and nobody hears you. Nobody takes you seriously. There was no response at all. And I tried a little bit more about, maybe Facebook's not a good thing, but people were not willing to engage me on that.
Well, I think Facebook has phenomenal potential.
Sure.
It's just right now, it's just sensory overload with what's going on.
Right.
So
right. What I've been arguing for is how do we as Christians act discerningly with our technology rather than just automatically going along with everything, because we're getting swept up into stuff that's destructive. And I think as Christians we could be more discerning about that. My 2 cents. All right.
Anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I'm going to stop recording if I can find it.
Can I add something in?
Sure.
It's Rob. I'm in Connie's space or something. Just something very important to me in the reality of worship is that it isn't coming from. This is not generated by me.
Right.
I mean, it's God revealing Himself, speaking, showing Himself, coming to us, and worship is integral with our response. We respond to God, and we don't, and it can be various. I mean, the Bible does say, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands." I mean, it can be loud and very, very happy. It can be contemplative. It can be the Quakers sitting around in a circle waiting for God to speak. It's whatever is that, whatever it calls forth, deep calling forth from deep. But first of all, it's God. God speaks, I respond. God speaks, I respond. That's worship. When it comes the other way, it's when we walk into a service and it's already decided how we're going to respond, what we're going to say, all that stuff, and it's just, well, that's not necessarily what worship is about. It can be a performance in some cases. It can be something we do out of obligation or rote. I want to lose myself. I want to hear God. I want to see God. I want to see Him high and lifted up. I want that smoke to fill the temple. I want the Kabbath to be present, and I want, and then God, please give me the courage, give me the humility, give me the experience of being able to respond in such a way as to send me forth with a strong feeling of presence and power.
Yeah, Rob, you make a hugely important theological point there too. I'm really impressed by the worship theology from this congregation today. And that is, everything we do is a response to God. It always starts with God's initiative, with God's grace. And it's not in our power or our control. It's always responding to God. And then there's another interesting question, and that's well, how does formal worship play into this, extemporaneous worship, spontaneous worship? And that's room for another whole discussion.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite churches ever in my life was Lorna and I were living in a shelter for a summer back in 1981 in the inner city of Detroit. And we went to an Episcopal church that had been influenced by the Jesus People movement. Remember the Jesus People? And they sang kind of folk songs, and they were charismatic, and they were in a poor neighborhood, and they had the Anglican liturgy. And I always thought this is such an amazing combination of liturgy and formality and spontaneity and extemporaneity and joy and solemnity. But we don't often get that all in the same place. But I do think that's what heaven's going to be like. So.
Cool. Thank you. All right. I'm going to stop just for time.